My name is Lester K. Edsall. I served in the Army Infantry for 46 months in World War II. I was married in November the 2nd of 1941, and within a month, Pearl Harbor happened, and we were thrown into the World War II. I was drafted and in July of 42, and I reported to Camp Croft in South Carolina, where they gave me 6 weeks of basic training. I had done fairly well on the written exams that they give you when you go into the Army, and they decided that they would give me some extra training, and they sent me to the Message Center, Training Center in Camp Croft. And there I was there for a couple of weeks, or possibly a month, and they decided that since I had done as well as I had on those written exams, that probably that I could go to Fort Benning and receive training to become an officer. Well, I was sent to Fort Benning, and 90 days later I was graduated as one of their 90-day wonders. And the entire class that I had been in at Fort Benning was absorbed by a unit called the Yankee Division, which was the Massachusetts National Guard, the 26th Infantry Division. This happened, it just so happened that this would be the only unit that I served with in all of the months that I was with the Army. I reported to the unit who was stationed at Camp Blanding in Florida. They had been called off of the coastal patrol, which they had been patrolling for since the beginning of the hostilities, and they were going to form a combat division, and so that was one of the reasons that they needed so many officers. Now, I reported to this organization, and we trained our units and when we spent time in Tennessee on Tennessee maneuvers, and one incident happened in Tennessee. We had a particularly rainy season, and we were just about to the end of our training as OCS, officer candidate material, and we were just about ready for graduation. So one of the last things that we were going to attempt was a river crossing, and with the rainy season that we had been having, the rivers were flooded, and they lost control of one of the crossing, the boat crossings, and it was swept downstream, and we lost we lost several of our officer candidates in that unit. So that was one bad incident that we had during that crossing. Well, most of the experiences from then till we were ready to go overseas was just routine training and rifle practice and all of the general activities that soldiers do in combat. So finally, we were getting ready to go overseas, and this was approaching September of 1944. We were finally ready to go overseas, and as an officer, well, first of all, we were sent overseas in a large ship which accommodated our whole unit, and it was the ship size was the one that is directly the next size smaller than the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. So we crowded all of the poor enlisted men into the bowels of the ship, and the officers, being an officer, we ate, we dined in a dining room with stemware and silverware, and we were served by waiters, and those poor enlisted men were down in there in the bottom of the ship eating from a gallery and sleeping in bunk beds maybe 6, 8 high. So my experience going overseas was a lot more pleasant than the men that I took with me overseas. And we finally got overseas, and we went in a convoy of 100 ships or more, and they were assembled, and their destination was, our destination was to land in Cherbourg, which had been under siege by the Americans, and they finally broke out of the peninsula, and General Patton raced across France to a point where he ran out of gas, and so he took up defensive positions there, and the port of Cherbourg had been pretty much destroyed by action, or army action there, but it was we were able to go ashore there and land in Cherbourg. So we waited on the peninsula for a while, and meanwhile they were using all kinds of transportation to get supplies across France to the Nancy area, which was in the east side of France. They were trying to get supplies for Patton so that he could continue to move forward and maybe on into Germany. So, but that took quite some time, so we were on the Cherbourg Peninsula until the 8th of October, and we were ordered to mount up on our trucks, and we were shuttled across France to get to the Nancy area, and we moved online on October the 8th to relieve Patton, who had been there for a couple of months, and so he moved out of the foxholes and we moved into them. And we did it so very well that the Germans didn't realize that Patton had been relieved there, and that a new unit was online. So we were really proud of that effort. When you're in combat, you need quite a few things. One thing you need is a lot of luck. Another thing you need is good, well-trained soldiers. And probably another thing is your survival instinct. If you're going to get back from the service, all of those things are very important, probably. And I mention this because I have been lucky most of my life, and I was in combat. We went online on the 8th of October, and I think about 2 days later, my runner and I were in the same foxhole that we had occupied, and a German shell came over and landed right on the parapet that goes around the foxhole, and it struck right close to the edge of the foxhole and just covered us completely with dirt and debris. And if there had been another 6 inches of distance in the trajectory of that shell, I probably wouldn't be here telling you about it, because the shell would have landed right into the foxhole and it would have been instant death to both of us. So that's an instance of how you depend on luck. Then we were there in that Nancy position for some time, and finally they got all of the supplies across the France and got them in the warehouses and places, and then they were getting ready for a push toward the Maginot and the Siegfried lines, and they had pretty well supplied Patton, and he was directed off to a different a different job in that area, and we remained in Patton's Third Army, and he was one of the most flamboyant and most respected military man in the area, and he was my favorite general. But we were getting ready to move toward the German territory, and that was to start on November the 8th, I think. So we all kicked off on schedule, and we all had our area that we were to attack on, and in the next day or so we had an attack through the woods, a night attack. And normally they don't like to do night attacks, but for some reason someone decided that we would have a night attack. And I traveled with my machine gunner. I'll go back a minute to tell you, when I joined the Yankee Division, I was assigned to a rifle platoon, and shortly after we got onto the Cherbourg Peninsula, the officer that had the weapons platoon, which was the machine gun and the mortars, and he was the executive officer of the company. He was taking some men down along the seashore on a exercise trip, just to give them a little exercise and to keep them from getting too bored, I guess. And he stepped on a mine and was killed. And so they moved me up to the weapons platoon, and I hadn't had any training with the mortars and machine guns, so I didn't really know how to operate with the mortars and machine gun. So I traveled with my machine gunner. There were two light air-cooled machine guns, and I traveled with one of those during our attack, and we were attacking a town called Vic-sur-Seille, and the Germans had pretty much moved out of the town, and we were clearing the rest of them out of the town, and my machine gunner and I were traveling right behind a tank that was moving through the town. We got to the end of a street and had to make a left turn, and just as the tank got to the corner and was slowly making the left turn, a German soldier appeared in a window to the right and shot a bazooka shell directly down on the tank and knocked it out. And my machine gunner immediately opened fire on that window, but of course the gunner or the German had stepped back and we didn't get him. But the reason I mentioned this incident, we traveled back. My wife and I traveled back to Germany in 1985, and I went back to this area where I had fought, and this is a very sentimental journey that you make, and we were going down through this town, and we came upon this street, and I immediately, after all those years, I immediately recognized that, and we went down to the end of the street, and there was the building that the German had come out of to fire this bazooka shell, and we looked up there. My wife and I, we looked at and the pock marks that my machine gunner had fired on the window. The pock marks were still there around the window, and that was a very moving moment for me. Those were my shots that were around the window. But anyway, we finished clearing out that town, and we moved on forward, and I forgot to mention that the reason I mentioned that night attack a few minutes ago, that was where I received my Purple Heart in that night attack. And again, luck was on my side. I received a ricochet bullet in my cheek, and that was my one Purple Heart for my service, and it was a cheap one because if it had been the whole bullet, it would have been a different story. But the little tip of the bullet just hit me in the cheek and lodged in the cheek, and it was in there, stayed in my cheek until the middle of December, and it worked itself out. But my Purple Heart that I got was a cheap one, but I guess it's still classified as a Purple Heart, so I still display that medal. We moved on out of Victor Seal, back to this story. We moved on out of Victor Seal, and we were moving without a whole lot of resistance, and we somehow the units on either side of us got held up, but the 3rd Battalion, which I was in, was moving forward, and we got almost 2 miles ahead of the units on either side of us, which is a very serious situation to be in. And to complicate things, we had lost contact with our artillery support, and the tanks ran out of gas, and they had to go back and get gas. So we were in a town called Rodalby, and we had decided to stop there, and we started digging our holes and our foxholes, and we decided we would wait. Evidently, that's what the battalion commander was counting on. Was going to wait until the supporting units came up on either side, and meanwhile, we were taking casualties there, quite a few casualties, and we couldn't really understand why. But we hunkered down and stayed there, and took our licks, and finally nighttime came, and with the nighttime came another complication. There was 2 barns and a house on fire, and they were in a large triangle, and our defensive unit that we were in L Company and M Company, the 3rd Battalion, we were right in the center of that triangle of light. And so even though darkness had fallen, it was almost like daylight there, and we were still taking casualties. And meanwhile, we had heard some rumblings of tanks and movement of the enemy, but that was to our front, so we didn't think anything about it. And finally, after nighttime came, the noise continued and went around, and they encircled us and cut us off. So we were in this circle of light, and my one machine gunner, who was set up on our left flank, had stopped firing, so I went out to see why the machine gun wasn't firing any longer, and I found the gunner and the sergeant. The sergeant had a terrific gash on the side of his head, and so I started back to the to my CP, which was in the town of Rodalby, and to see if I could get some medical help for him. And as I came into this circle of light, I saw a couple of German soldiers in the center of this light. One had a white flag, and the other one was an SS officer. And I thought, boy, hey, I'm going to be able to capture a couple of Germans. And so I went over to them, and I find that instead of me capturing them, they were looking for the senior officer to submit a proposal of surrender to them, that and to show them why they needed to consider that. So I find out that I'm the senior officer, and so I'm the one they wanted to talk to, evidently. So he told, this SS officer was immaculate, and straight, ramrod soldier, and I really respected him right from the start. But he told me that, he showed me what situation we were in. He said, now we can continue this if you want to, and we're going to pick that foxhole off, this foxhole, and he just went around and said, this is what they were. Their tanks were in the dark, and we were in the light, so we had no way of knowing how to defend that area. So it was a no-win situation for us. But he said, I'll give you some time to collect your units together and tell them and you can tell them what their situation is and decide what you want to do. So I called my company together and told them what the situation was, and and there was M Company is a heavy machine gun unit. They were with me too. They were with us. So I called all of the people together that I could get together and told them what their story was and showed them how vulnerable we were, and that we could decide what we wanted to do. Well, some of my one sergeant that I had at one time, the first sergeant that I had in the first platoon, said that he didn't like the idea of being a POW, and I said, well, neither do I. And but I had given the German officer my word that I would return with an answer. So I told Sergeant Barnes that if he could get his platoon out without any casualties, to go ahead and to take all those that he could gather together back there in reserve and get them out of the area. And so I went back after a time, after the agreed on time, I went back and told the German officer that I had my personnel that he could see here was going to throw down their arms. And so that's the way I was captured. my company commander hadn't told me that I was the only officer left in the company, and he had gone out of our position earlier, riding on a tank, claiming to be injured, and so that's how I was left holding the bag out there. So I went back and told the German officer that we would surrender our arms, and so this is how I was taken prisoner. At the time, I knew I could see the vulnerability of the company, and I had no second thoughts about my decision at that time to turn over the remains of the company. So, and it wasn't until later that I got that I thought about it, and that was long after I was out of service that I thought about it, and I just so I never talked very much about my experience in the service. Well, we were captured that night, and I haven't any idea how many enlisted men or I don't think there were any officers that were captured, but I don't know how many enlisted men there were, but there were several, I know. But we were gathered together, and the officer, I was separated and taken immediately away from my troops, and then the troops were gathered, and I was whisked away in an automobile, and the troops were marched away from the front line so that they wouldn't be retaken by our troops again the next day. So I ended up in a German army camp called Limburg. It was at the city of Limburg. I forget what the number of the 7A maybe, but it was a sort of a distribution center for the Germans. They would shuttle all of the prisoners into this one camp, and then they would decide which permanent camps they were going to send them to. So this, some of my enlisted men went to farm concentration places, and some of my non-coms ended up close to the German-Polish border over. I think maybe their camp number was Stalag 3A. I'm not. That sounds familiar to me. And then I was sent on over into Poland to an all ground force officers camp at Szubin, which was close to Warsaw. And I got there. I was captured on my daughter's first birthday, and I got to the Szubin after terrible experiences in cattle cars and shellings on sidings whenever the trains would get stopped, or during the day, they didn't travel during the day, they would stop on these railroad crossings. Then the Air Force would come over and bomb the railroad sidings that we were on. So it was a hectic time till I finally got to Shubin, and I got there on the 16th of December. That camp was very well organized, and they met us with some Red Cross parcels, and then we got settled there into that routine, and I learned the the bad parts of being, or the bad experiences of being a POW. The food was almost non-existent, and I was near the kitchen one time, and I had been a Kroger store manager, and I recognized cuts of meat and sides of meat, and I was close to the kitchen at the POW camp there in Shubin, and I saw them carry in a carcass of meat, and I knew what beef carcasses looked like, and I found out that this was a carcass of a horse, which they were bringing in to make soup for us there at Shubin. So that was my first experience of eating horse meat. I had we had a fairly nice setup there, because you have to understand the mindset of the Germans. They demanded that their officers be respected, and the higher the rank, the more respect. And finally, they get down, and the respect even goes to the non-commissioned officers. But when you get down to the private in the German army, they were just they were expendable. Let's put it that way. So we were all officers there at this camp, and so we were. Germans wanted their officers treated like gentlemen, and so they did the best they could to treat their. They did the best to treat us this way also. We were there for a period of time. And meanwhile, the Russians were moving eastward, or moving westward toward the German mainland, and so the Germans were pretty well occupied with the Normandy invasion, and they were pretty much involved with the Russian offensive. So they were nearing Poland, and the Germans decided that they needed to get these camps that were close to the advance. They needed to get these camps evacuated, because they wanted, in case they lost the war, they needed some bargaining material. So they intended to use their prisoners of war as part of their bargaining points. So they were getting close to the camp, and finally they decided that they would have to move us out of Poland. So on January the 21st, Yeah, on January the 21st, we moved out of off Flag 64 and into weather that was 50 degrees below zero, the coldest weather that they had for over 100 years, and we were moving from the protection of the barracks into the open area of the roads, and so our future didn't look all that great at that particular time. Well, they had no supply service for the POWs, so which means that while we were traveling along these roads, we were living off the land. So they had to either find food for you or you did without, and they had to find protection for you at night, or you stayed out in the open. So several of the places that we stayed were large cattle barns or large livestock installations, and so we were always glad to get in there because the animals had a certain amount of heat that they gave off, and it was out of the wind and the snow, and so it was a welcome place to be under the circumstances. We stayed in schoolhouses and warehouses and other army camps that had been evacuated, and there were 1,500 of us that started out of Poland, and of course, if we all went down the same road, it would be very hard to find food for us for all 1,500 of us. So they divided us into smaller groups, and we traveled in the same general direction, but along parallel roads, and the smaller units were easier to house and to feed. So we the first night out we don't know for sure, but we think maybe some of the Russians there used that the soldiers moving into their livestock place. They butchered a hog, and we think it was the Russians that actually butchered it, but I mentioned being a survivor earlier. I think maybe that's one of the reasons that I was right handy there, and I was able to get I got myself a nice big chunk of pork out of this one hog that they butchered. So I think that was my one survival instinct kicking in. But we traveled generally speaking that way along the highways, and these roads were fairly highly occupied because there were a lot of Germans that had moved into Poland when Germany overtook them, and they took up residence there and took up jobs, and now that the Germans were being defeated, they started to they had to go back to Germany. They were being displaced by the Polish people who were moving back in. So, and the Russians were coming, so they wanted to get, they were on the highway, and many of them had all their worldly possessions were in a pack on their back, and and in spite of everything, you couldn't help but feel sorry for anyone that can carry their worldly possessions on their back. We traveled that way for several weeks, and so finally some of them were getting footsore and were developing conditions where they couldn't continue. So they somehow gathered together some box cars ahead of us, and when we got to this one particular spot, the sick and the lame and those that were unable to go any further were loaded onto box cars. They had a few vacant spots that were available, and you hesitate to trust an enemy such as we had, but you have to be able to make certain decisions, right or wrong. Well, along with the column, when you stayed with the column, you had a certain amount of security as being with all of these American officers, and you hated to forfeit that security, but they had a few spaces available on this train, and so I decided that I would see if I could get on one of those, and sure enough, they had room for me, and so I boarded the train on the 28th of it was late in February. I had been on the road for about a month, and I traded. I boarded the train for whatever destination, and had no idea. We had heard rumors about how they used to would tell you that you were going to give you a shower, and would herd you into a big room, and instead of being a shower of water, there would be a gas would come out of those jets, and they would exterminate all of the personnel that was in this room. So we heard all sorts of rumors like that, and so you sort of hesitated to volunteer for anything. But I boarded the train, and a few days later, or a week, I ended up in Luckenwald, which is a camp 30 miles south of Berlin, straight south of Berlin. And when I arrived there, it was already overcrowded, and then moving. We had probably 150 men in this shipment that arrived there. So, but we were crowded into the already crowded positions in Luckenwald. And Luckenwald, the camps were usually not ruled, but they were, the senior officer was usually the one in charge of the prisoner personnel, and the one that was in Luckenwald was a Norwegian general, And when we got to Luckenwald, he gave us some of his Danish parcels that they had, and these Red Cross parcels and Danish parcels are unsung heroes of the Army, because there were untold number of soldiers that would never have made it if it hadn't been for Red Cross parcels and these other parcels that came. And I want to say a good word about the YMCA. We had a Swedish representative that came to our camp when we were in Flag 64, and he was a camp inspector, and besides that, he was a representative of the YMCA. And what the the Red Cross furnished food and other little necessities, and the YMCA, they supplied recreational equipment and library equipment, musical equipment, and that sort of thing. And between the two organizations, they probably saved a lot of lives, physically and mentally both. But this German or the Norwegian general did the best he could, and we were allowed to move about between the English. There were English there, and Americans and Italians. There were all sorts of denominations there, and we were allowed to move around, but part of the camp was divided, and there were also enlisted men, and we weren't allowed to associate with those. There was a double fence between the officers and the enlisted men, and they were not allowed to speak with each other or fraternize in any way. So I saw several of my enlisted men when I got to Luckenwald. They were on the other side of the barbed wire, but I couldn't get to them to say anything to them. We were there at Luckenwald for some time, and the closer and closer the Russians got, the more nervous everybody got, and so the people in Luckenwald were really getting alarmed because the Russians were getting so close. So our senior officer, the senior American officer, selected certain officers to go into Luckenwald with the Germans' permission. They were allowed to go into Luckenwald and stand around on the corners and make their presence known, to give sort of a solace to the German people, and to sort of calm their fears if they could. And I was chosen as one of them to go in and stand on the corner, and you would see a German door open, and someone would scurry out of the door and come over and say something to you, and you knew they were wanting to know when the Americans were going to get there. And we'd have to tell them, well, the Americans weren't coming, that they were going to be stopped back at the Elbe River, and so they would never get to Luckenwald. And then they would turn around with tears in their eyes and go back back and close their door again. And again this would happen. And finally the Russians did get there. And what was happening, they were moving on Berlin. And so they came from the east, and they circled down around south of Berlin and came up through Luckenwald, which was in a direct straight line to Berlin, only 30 miles south of it. So their attack on Berlin was going to be through Luckenwald. And I happened to be on the corner when the Russians came through. And that's the first time I had ever seen a Russian or a combat infantry woman. There were these burly Russian gals were sitting on these tanks. Of course, they weren't fighting at that time going through Luckenwald, but they were sitting on this tank coming through the town and moving north, and sitting with their arms crossed and with a very arrogant look on their face, and I might say a tough looking look. So the Germans really did have something to be concerned about. Well, the Russians moved through the town and were taking up positions south of Berlin to make the assault on Berlin. And the German guards in Luckenwald had all fled before the Russians got there. So when the Russians finally did get there, they immediately put a guard around the camp. So the guards changed the only thing that changed was the guards went from Germans to Russians, and other than that, the situation remained the same. Well, they were up there fighting for Berlin, and we've come to the end of April now, and this is the first part of May, and they're fighting for Berlin, and the Americans in the camp Luckenwald were told not to try to escape, but a lot of us were getting a little bit antsy and thought if the Russians did free us, we'd probably have to be repatriated through Russia, and that didn't sound too good to some of us anyway. So long about May the 5th or 6th, I was getting a little bit concerned. We would hear screams out some screams out close to camp, and then you would hear a rat-tat-tat of a automatic weapon, and no more screams. So we decided that was some of the Russians getting even with some of the Germans, and so that didn't allay our fears a whole lot either. So finally it came to about May the 6th, and I decided that I was going to leave camp and see if I could get back to the Elbe River, because we knew that the Americans were sending trucks, those large 6x trucks. They were sending them across and picking up straggler POWs and taking them back across the border or the river. So I knew that there would be somebody out there surely, and so I decided to take off, and the Russians, in order to keep to intimidate us, would fire bursts of automatic weapons down the perimeter of the camp in order to discourage any escapes or anything. So I finally decided that I would try to get out, and I timed it so that I would be in between machine gun bursts, and I finally I got out of the camp and headed toward the American lines anyway, and so we had to stay hidden because we didn't want the Russians to pick us up, and which they would have done if they had seen us. So we stayed, we hid during the day. As we traveled, we hid, and finally I saw a truck coming across, and I hailed the truck, and he picked me up, and we turned around and picked up another couple and sped back across the Elbe River, and I was finally freed. I was taken back to an echelon back where they had DC-3s, and they flew me out of that area and over to Epinal, where they gave me new uniforms and let me clean up a little bit, and then I was sent to Camp Lucky Strike, which did a lot of the repatriation of soldiers and POWs in that area, and I was there for a while, and they fed us as much as they could get down us. We had milkshakes 24 hours a day if we wanted them, and we could get a sandwich anytime we wanted it, and we could eat whenever we felt hungry. We could eat. So I put on, just the short time I was there, I got to a weight that I had never been at before, and so finally the time came for me to leave Camp Lucky Strike, and they booked me on a boat called the Monticello, which was a far cry from the boat that I went over on, and we got back to the United States, and I remember what a beautiful sight the Statue of Liberty is. If you've never had your freedom taken away, you really can't appreciate what freedom is like. I got back, and they gave me directions on what my future was going to be. So I was to go home and be home for a little repatriation, and then they sent myself and my wife down to Miami, Florida for R&R. And we had a nice time down there at that time. And then I came back, and they sent me to Fort Benning for a refresher course. intending to send me to the South Pacific. The war wasn't quite over there yet, and the bomb hadn't been dropped yet. So they were anticipating having to invade Japan, and they knew that there was going to be a bloodbath there, that there would be a tremendous number of officers and men would lose their lives there. So they were gathering together a bunch of officers to sacrifice on the shores of Japan. But I was after Fort Benning, after Fort Benning and in the training that I got there, I went to Camp Robinson, and while I was at Camp Robinson, they dropped the bombs, and the war was over shortly after that. So I didn't have to go to the South Pacific after all.